of Israeli settlements, and has sort of used that as a pressure point to say, look, I'm not all in with Benjamin Netanyahu. Yes, he's my great friend. He's my good friend, but I disagree with him passionately on this issue. When it's come to Gaza, though, President Biden has been very aggressive in his support for Israel throughout the decades of military campaigns and supporting the merciless blockade that was imposed on Gaza. And I think that, it's a mistake to try to just take politicians at their word. I think the dark conclusion we have to draw is that much of this Gaza campaign has proceeded in a way that President Biden must support. Because at every turn, when the United States could have used its unprecedented leverage in the world to try to stop it, it has instead sent more weapons, prevented a ceasefire from being voted to go through at the United Nations, has been defending Israel against genocide allegations at the International Court of Justice. So, I think it's a mistake to say, let's let politicians' words speak for them. The actions are what matter. And, on a policy level, the actions indicate that it's proceeding exactly how the White House wants it to. More than 25,000 Palestinians dead, more than 63,000 wounded. You have women having cesarean sections with no anesthesia. Children are having limbs amputated with no anesthesia. You have a hepatitis A outbreak. You have Gazans with 1 in 480 of them access to a toilet, one toilet for every 480 people right now. I mean, this is an abomination, and I'm sorry, Anthony Blinken is not at a think tank anymore. The Secretary of State doesn't get to go to Davos and say to Tom Friedman, oh, what is to be done? Because what has been done is that the United States has offered political, legal, diplomatic, and military support for a scorched earth campaign that has killed an unprecedented number of civilians in a very short amount of time, Steve.
I'd like to play a sound clip of you of the Secretary of State Anthony Blinken here and get your thoughts.
None of the suffering would have happened if Hamas hadn't did what it did on October 7th, and had it made different decisions thereafter.
None of the suffering that we're seeing would have happened if Hamas hadn't taken its acts on October 7th. What are your thoughts, Jeremy?
Well, Hamas and the Palestinians could make a very similar argument to Anthony Blinken that would also, lack moral clarity, which is October 7th wouldn't have happened if Israel hadn't for 75 straight years been waging a war of annihilation against Palestinians, usurping Palestinian land, imposing an apartheid state in the West Bank, gunning down Palestinians when they did what Western leaders say they should be doing, which is to demonstrate nonviolently. In 2018, 2019, during the Great March of Return, when Palestinians organized nonviolent demonstrations at the fence of the prison that they live in with Israel, Israeli soldiers engaged, and this is not my conjecture, this is a Haaretz investigative piece citing soldiers by name, boasting of how they had a competition of who could shoot the most kneecaps of the protesters of Palestinians. So, to make an argument that pretends that October 7th was the beginning of the story of Israel and Palestine, or even a war with Gaza, is really intellectually dishonest. But also, Steve, that line that Blinken has deployed many times, that John Kirby has said, that President Biden has said, that the Israelis say regularly, that all this could end if Hamas would just lay down its weapons, release the hostages, and surrender, is akin to a kind of sadistic torturer who's saying to their victim, this will all just end if you only tell us who the real terrorists are. This is sick to use the women and children, the civilians of Gaza, as sort of a pile of corpse that you're going to justify by saying, well, Hamas needs to release the hostages and lay down their weapons. There's 75 years of history here that could be pointed to that doesn't look good for Israel on a moral or political level. So I reject that. I think it's intellectually dishonest, and I think it's morally vapid.
I feel it's Vietnam. I feel if I were having watched television and seen the horrors of Vietnam, I feel in this. Do you feel that Americans are hearing or feeling this in any way at all, or Europeans or other observers are seeing this as another Vietnam?
Well, I think that on a purely analytical, historical level, I think it's an apt comparison. And when occupying powers try to fight against a guerrilla force, and that's ultimately what Hamas is, and it's using tactics that are very similar to those used by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. You can very quickly get yourself mired in a quagmire. And back in November, I started talking about how it already seemed like on a tactical military level that Israeli forces were already finding themselves in a quagmire. If you follow Hamas's communications, and by the way, I think there's a totally cartoonish portrayal of Hamas that exists in much of the Western discourse, and I think it's a journalistic error. I think we have an obligation to understand who it is that we're being told are the new ISIS or the new Nazis. But when you look at Hamas's communications, they are every single day releasing multiple videos of their attacks against Israeli soldiers. And in fact, there was a very deadly incident in mid-January. It was the single highest casualty incident that we know about of Israeli forces when IDF soldiers, an engineering corps, was attempting to rig two structures in eastern Gaza outside of the Maghazi refugee camp with explosives, with mines. And there was some sort of an attack that took place from Hamas, and Hamas later released a video of it where they launched an RPG that appears to have set off a chain reaction that actually exploded the mines that these Israeli soldiers were trying to place in these buildings and brought the buildings down upon the soldiers, killing 21 of them. And I think that that was in some ways a metaphor for where the war stands right now. It's sort of collapsing on the heads of the Israeli soldiers that have been sent there on this war of annihilation that Netanyahu is boasting he's not going to quit until the end. The fact of the matter is that this is becoming a war of attrition. Hamas does not seem to be taking the kinds of casualties that Israel boasted of early on. These tunnel networks, Israel has only been able to penetrate a very small fraction of them. And at every turn, you see Netanyahu doubling down, even as the families of the hostages, the families of those killed on October 7th, ordinary Israelis are increasingly questioning whether or not Netanyahu even knows what he's doing or whether it's worth the cost to Israel to continue in this manner. So I think that there are some grave strategic mistakes that have already been made by Netanyahu in this. And the fact that the Biden administration is not at this point just sort of saying this has to stop. Let's remember, Steve, when people say, oh, what can Biden do? In 2021, the last time that Netanyahu engaged in this kind of, in a sort of heavy bombardment attack against Gaza, and it was far lower in intensity than what we've seen over the past 100+ days, Joe Biden got to a point where he wanted it to end. He called Bibi. He basically said, it's burned enough. You're going to talk to the Egyptians. And within a couple of days, the thing was done. It was being wrapped up. So let's not pretend that Joe Biden doesn't have the power. And the fact of the matter is, you can read the Israeli press, which in some ways is far more open about what's going on in Gaza than the American or British press, to be honest. And you can see that some of the top defense correspondents for Israeli publications are saying what I just said, that there is real danger that this is becoming a quagmire, and that even within the ranks of the Israeli security forces, there are serious questions about whether this is a viable strategy to continue this way. But also, and I think crucially, there's an acknowledgement among the defense elite in Israel that if Biden was to threaten a cutoff of military support, particularly weapons, this thing would have to be wrapped up very, very quickly.
Hamas is demanding a ceasefire